Hi there, Renaud Anjoran from Agilian. A lot of companies come to us to develop new products. Maybe they're just at the design phase, maybe they already have prototypes, maybe they're very advanced, but we end up always giving sort of the same advice. So we distilled it into 7 tips of design for manufacturing. Hope it's helpful. Thanks. Here is our presentation with 7 tips for successful design for manufacturing, typically for manufacturing in China or Vietnam. Okay, so this is me, Renaud Anjoran. I'm going to go straight into the first part, the strategy. So first you need to think in advance. Do you want to go ODM or OEM or contract manufacturer? What kind of factory do you want to work with? So ODM, in the context of buying from China, Vietnam, Thailand, India, what does that mean, ODM and OEM? ODM means they already have the product or maybe the module that can go into your product. And it's already developed and you can use it. And in some cases you might need them to make changes to it, to customize it. OEM means you coming with your new product and they're going to make it. And typically they are already making similar products. Contract manufacturer is also, like OEM, the case where it is the development of a new product. However, the business model is a little bit different, as we're going to see in the next 3 slides. So first, ODM, obviously if they've already developed that module or the entire product, it means low or zero R&D cost, very fast to market, and the problem is they are in a position of strength and you might not be able to negotiate some good terms, and especially if you are just taking the entire product that they've developed with a few changes, you are basically their distributor. Okay, so yes, it's possible to have them make some changes if you can show them that your design is promising, your ideas are promising, you have a market and so on. However, there's also IP protection issues. They might see what you want to do and do it for themselves or for their own current customers. Okay, so there are pros and cons here, like everywhere. OEM, so it might be not very long or it might be long depending on the complexity of the product, obviously. If they really make already very similar products, it's still a new product that they're going to have to develop from scratch. However, they are very familiar with the technologies and the materials and the application and so on. Okay, and as part of their business model, typically they will subsidize some or all of the cost of the R&D. So you might have to pay for the tooling or half of the tooling, but a lot of the engineering work is done for free. The problem is it is not really your product. Now it really depends on the kind of contract, manufacturing, development contract and manufacturing contract that you're going to have with them. But typically you don't have all the intellectual property in your hands in this case, right? And also you don't have visibility on the components. You don't really see the sub-suppliers, okay? And that means you don't have full control over what they're doing, okay? And of course they're tempted to compete with you if your sales are high, or to just cut you off and sell your product, but actually in their mind it's their product. Now, contract manufacturers have a slightly different business model. So the buyer is expected to pay for all the design work, all the tooling, all the engineering work, and in return, they're going to own the design. They can typically negotiate for an agreement that gives them visibility over the supply chain, so who the component suppliers are and so on. More visibility and more control over a lot of things. Okay, and since you have all the design deliverables in your hands, you can change from one contract manufacturer to another. Now, obviously, this means also, yeah, there might be more R&D work. It might take a bit longer, especially if they're not expert in that specific kind of product. Okay. I try to summarize it a little bit like this. So if the sales volume is very low anyway, no supplier is going to be interested. And that's even more true with contract manufacturers than the other ones. And typically if you have really low volumes, maybe in some cases, you might do some private labeling or something with an ODM, but otherwise this is a no-go zone. And then it really depends on how much control you want. Okay, and also how new your product is. So if you're comfortable relying on a supplier, not really being able to move to another one, using the technologies that they own, then an ODM might be fine. If you want something really new, an OEM will be what you need. And then as your volume gets higher and the level of control that you need is also greater, you will want to work with a contract manufacturer. Okay, so it really depends on your situation, and it has a lot of impacts, as we'll see in the next slides. Now, tip number 2 is requirements about the product and the way it's going to work and so on are nice, but it needs to be very, very specific. Okay, you can't just say, it should work in cold weather. No, it has to be really, really specific. And you also need to clarify what you can accept and cannot accept. Okay, so here's 4 sort of approaches. So the first one is to get a golden sample and approve it. That's great for the touch and the feel of the product and the aesthetic look. That's great. And obviously there should be one in your hands, one in the supplier's hands, and maybe one in your inspector's hands at the very least. But it's not sufficient. You also need to put down on paper in a document, what is required, really in very specific terms with tolerances where it's possible. Okay, that becomes the checklist for the inspectors typically, and it also helps your manufacturer validate their prototypes, for example. Okay, and don't forget also the bill of materials. You have to know what the key materials and components are in your product. Otherwise, how can you check it later and make sure the manufacturer is not trying to pull a trick on you? Making a list of potential defects is very helpful to avoid going into discussions and arguments later. Okay, so this is a very simple way, a list of potential defects, and you say whether it's critical, major, or minor. This comes from a standard about PCBA defects, and you can really go into the details of detailed photos or sketches, and then you say maybe this is major, this is minor, with a very clear description every time. That's obviously best practice. You can also use physical samples and take some photos, obviously, but also leave the samples with your supplier and make sure that they know all of these issues that you do not accept. Okay, that they keep it in their eyes. Very, very useful for training inspectors. And in many cases, it's not very obvious, is this acceptable or not? So it's good to have boundary samples. So you might say, okay, this is a tiny, tiny little blemish here. It's fine. We can accept it. No problem. Now, the limit of acceptance is between these 2 samples. This is still okay, but limit plus. And this one is really under it's not acceptable. Okay, this is very, very useful for those defects where it's really subjective. Okay. Now, when you go to manufacturers, you have to show them you have a mature design. So I have 3 examples for the industrial design. Okay, if you go with something like this, which is basically a back of a napkin sketch, people will not take you seriously. Right? You need at the very least to have something like this. It doesn't include a lot of information. There's still a lot of work to do, but fine. Already they can have a good idea about what you want to do, and they can start to ask a lot of questions. right? Obviously, it's better if you come with designs in CAD software, ideally with the materials and the tolerances and the exact colors and so on, all documented, right? The more work you have done on your side, the more mature your design is, and the more seriously potential suppliers will take your project. Okay, a very important concept, the 1-10-100 rule, and why it's not wise to rush into production. Here's, in a nutshell, what it means. If there's an issue, if you find it when you are doing your design on paper or in CAD software, it's usually pretty simple and pretty fast to fix. I don't know, it's a part for plastic injection molding, and you forget to take into account the daft angles. Actually this shape is not going to work. I change the shape a little bit. Okay, done. Fine. That's fast and cheap. If you do it after you've made some prototypes or some tooling, well, it's much more expensive. If you realize that problem after you've already made 5,000 pieces, it's even more expensive, right? And so on and so on and so forth. If it's after you ship the goods, it's even more expensive. So finding the issues and working on fixing them earlier in the project is much cheaper than waiting later and finding out later and fixing the issue later, right? In time and in money. So these are a few very common guidelines. Very simple, really. You need to think, when you are defining your requirements, can this be made at the standard that I'm requiring, or is this not going to be workable? On prototyping, as you get close to the final prototype, try to use the same materials, the same equipment as will be used in mass production. Keep a list of risks, do something about them. Supplier component quality, extremely important. Otherwise you get some poor quality components and you embed them into your products, and then you have a huge problem. Go slowly into mass production. Start with small volumes. I'll go over that again just after with the pilot run. Okay, and keep an eye on what's happening during mass production, because if you don't detect issues in mass production and you let the manufacturer ship the goods out, well, that's going to be even more expensive to you. Okay, the pilot run, yes. So this is basically before the first relatively large batch in mass production. You need to release 40 pieces, 50 pieces, 70 pieces, 100 pieces. It depends kind of on the type of product, the size of the product, and so on. But you see how it's going, you see what the issues are, you push for iterations basically to fix these issues. Okay. Bill of material, the BOM, very important document, extremely important document, is the list of your components, okay, your parts, your materials, and so on, the packaging, everything. Okay, as much as possible, go for standard mass market parts. They tend to be more reliable, they tend to be of higher quality. Obviously, if it's a new product, you probably have some custom parts to design and develop and manufacture. But if you have three custom parts, it's much safer than having a dozen custom parts. Okay. Try to keep it visible to you. Now, an ODM manufacturer will usually never do that. An OEM will only do that if you really push them hard from the beginning and you have an agreement about that, right? At the very least, the critical parts, the most critical parts, you really need to know where they come from, how they're going to be marked, and so on, right? And yes, the BOM, you might not have the BOM in your hands, okay? But that means when you receive the goods, how can you check that they used the same components as last time and last time and last time? And if something fails, if some tests fail, maybe you will never really know why. That can lead to a lot of issues. Now, another very important concept is that you design the product, and people tend to focus a lot on the product design. Of course, you need to nail that. However, process design and process validation are extremely important too. and as much as possible you need to have them done in parallel, right? So this comes from the automotive industries, the APQP they call it. Very, very sophisticated approach, very good, proven approach, but it's typically for very high volume parts that have to be high quality. This might not be your situation. However, there are a few key takeaways here that are really, really important. So here's the product design and development. Here's the process design and development. As you work on the product design, you need to think of the process design. Oh, I'm going to have an enclosure in plastic. Okay, for the product design for the prototypes, yeah, I can have them maybe 3D printed or maybe CNC machined out of a block of plastic or something like that. But I can also start to think of the process design. Maybe making silicone mold is also going to be very inexpensive and fast, but this will actually get me closer to the real hard steel mold for thermoplastics that I will end up using in mass production. So it's probably better to go with silicone mold in this example, right? So this is where you think of how it's going to be made and what kind of issues can pop up in production, right, as you're still designing the product. You see prototype here, final prototype, and then pilot run here. There's still a lot of work between these two. Okay, it's not like, okay, we have prototype, then we go pilot run immediately, and then pilot run is done, okay, production launch immediately. Actually, if you have your prototype done, you might not even be 50% done in all of the work before production. Okay, so there's still some process design and development to make, maybe some tooling, some fixtures and jigs and test stations and things like that. And also it needs to be validated. There's a lot of work on checking that it actually works and that the issues are caught by the testing stations and things like that. Then you do your pilot run. This is really sort of the confirmation of a lot of things, and you might still have quite a few issues to fix before it's really safe for releasing into production launch. Now, if the volumes are not very high, you can go faster into production launch. But if you're going to go into a $200,000 product launch right away out of the gate for the first batch, you better spend some time to fine-tune things and troubleshoot until it's really ready for low-risk production. Okay, it really depends on your intended volumes, of course, and the risks. A couple of examples of things that are often forgotten. The product engineering changes might come very late into the process, and they might have a lot of implications, a lot of impact on the process. So you get to be careful with that. Okay, very good planning is important. And the testing stations, we've seen a lot of cases where people want to go ahead as fast as they can, but they haven't nailed the process, the testing stations yet. Okay, this is an example. We always try to make sure that this is developed, maybe not at the stage of the prototypes, but shortly thereafter. Otherwise, we're just running behind them, and starting a mass production, without that is extremely risky. Usually, we don't want to do that. Okay, so a lot of planning is needed to avoid these common issues. And obviously, maybe you were expecting that from the beginning of the presentation, but actually it's only tip number 7. Some examples of things you need to keep in mind when you plan, all the way, from the start, for manufacturability, for cost, for quality, for distribution, and so on. So a few key points. Obviously, it could be a much longer list of things that our R&D engineers keep in mind when they develop a new product for a customer. The fewer the parts, the better. Things like fasteners, for example, just tend to fail and tend to lead to issues. If you can avoid that, is better. Common parts, standardized parts are always good. They make the whole thing easier, safer. Lower risk. Yeah, consistently produced is very, very important here. If it's very hard to fabricate a certain part, well, maybe there's a problem with that part. What can we do to um, to have it made with a higher yield, meaning with fewer rejects and much less rework. Okay, operation for assembly especially. How can we make things simple, very obvious, so that they get assembled easily? Otherwise, it's gonna lead to more stoppages, slower work, quality issues, and so on. Adjustments also, it's got to like be right there, pop up in place, and not be adjusted. Otherwise, same thing. If you have an engineer make 5 pieces, sure, he can adjust it so that they're nice. But if you go into production for 10,000 pieces, some of them are not going to be adjusted very well. Okay, self-locating features. That's just an example. Something that is press fit, and it's press fit. It goes into place, and it's kept into place. There's a lot of ways that things can be assembled this way, and it's always better than, for example, using screws. It's faster, it's more precise, and so on. Design to cost. We've had a number of projects where at the beginning the customers were very enthusiastic, and then as we ran through all of their requirements and the cost of the bill of material and so on, well, the cost ended up much higher than their target cost. It's better to know about that from the very beginning. So what they should have done is think from the beginning, about the labor cost, the assembly time, the handling, but also material selection, extremely important. Okay, and manufacturing methods. So here are a few examples again that our R&D team tends to keep in mind. How many components are needed, how much labor, yes. The BOM costs, extremely important. Feature creep within the design, yes. So a key piece of advice here is try to keep your design simple. If you're developing it for version 1, keep some of the features for version 2. Okay. By that time you will have learned a lot from the marketplace also, so your plan might have changed by that time. Okay, test rigs, tooling, and things like that. Also, reliability is very important, because if you offer, for example, a 2-year warranty, but the way it's been designed means it fails 50% of the time within 1 year, well, you're going to have a lot of returns, a lot of warranty costs, right? So this is just a silly little example with a reliability test on a display of a tablet or a big phone, a tablet, right? Just to confirm that reliability is going to be all right. There's a lot of ways to confirm that. Design for quality. Same idea here. What has to be taken into account at the design stage to reduce the risk of quality issues? So simplify the design, definitely. Think of the issues. Maybe during prototyping you already see a lot of the issues. Well, try to design them out, right? A robust tolerance understanding for each part, yes, very important. If you go for a process that's not very capable of holding very tight tolerances, but your design absolutely requires very tight tolerances, that's going to be an issue, right? Standardized parts, yes, as I said. Yes, a multifunctional team driving the process. Oops. So what that means is, don't just have an R&D engineer do things, in their corner. Involve someone from manufacturing, involve someone from quality. If it involves a component supplier, work very closely with that component supplier. Otherwise, you might find out, real example, that glue is not supposed to bond plastic and wood together. Oh, we didn't know. And then the supplier said, but you never told us it was for plastic and glue, of course, and wood. Of course, this would never work, right? Communication extremely important here. Error proof, yes. This is, see the example here of a way to make it impossible to place this part of the die upside down. It always has to be in the right orientation. A lot of quality issues with manual labor is related to these kind of things, and it can actually be totally eliminated with this type of approach. Design for distribution, I mention it also because it's more and more important as more and more goods are sold in e-commerce. So there's actually two sides here. One is product protection, okay, and at the same time also minimizing logistics costs. So product protection, so there's a lot of ways to test, free fall drop test, compression test, vibration test, and so on, to make sure your product is protected. Also at the same time, logistics costs. Now if you sell something, maybe one of your channels is Amazon, well, the problem is if your package is huge, just that might actually double the full price of your product, right? So pay a lot of attention to that and plan for the logistics costs of the product when it's in the full the delivery box, right? Because we had some projects also where customers had very bad surprises when they thought about that too late. Okay, so thank you. This is our website. You can send us an email here. Always happy to talk to you if you have some projects for manufacturing a new product, or simply maybe you are already working with another manufacturer to make your product and you want to transfer production to a good manufacturer. We're always happy to talk about these things.